The moment I heard the frantic voice screaming across the cul-de-sac, I knew something ridiculous had started, but I had no idea just how absurd it was going to get. A red-faced woman was pounding on my car window, waving a small piece of metal, shouting, "This is unacceptable. I demand access now." Her heels clicked on the driveway as she stomped toward my vehicle, which was parked perfectly within my own driveway, unlocked yet untouched. That woman, of course, was Karen HOA Karen, the terror of the neighborhood, and today, she had apparently decided that my car was her new target. From inside the house, I peeked through the blinds. She was waving a shiny brass key like it was the Holy Grail, turning it over in her hands, muttering, "This must work. It has to work." I swallowed a laugh. Most people would have noticed a locked car meant you didn't have the keys. But Karen never did things the normal way. To her, authority was absolute, unquestionable, and meant to be enforced at all times, even against private property. Then came the call that would take this from ridiculous to absolutely hilarious. Karen dialed 911, her voice trembling with panic and outrage. "Yes. This is an emergency. Someone is denying me access to a vehicle I need to inspect. This is harassment. I need law enforcement immediately." She didn't pause to explain what vehicle, whose property it was, or that she didn't even own a master key that worked. She just screamed and waved the key like it could magically compel the universe to obey her. I couldn't resist anymore. I stepped outside, calm, collected, and, as always, completely in control. Karen spun around when she noticed me, her eyes widening as if she had just seen a ghost. "Sheriff," she shrieked, pointing her tiny finger at me, trembling. "I need your help. This car is locked. It won't open. You have to intervene." She had no idea. I held up my badge, letting it catch the sunlight. "Karen," I said slowly, savoring her expression, "this car belongs to me." And, I paused, giving her one long, incredulous look, "I am the sheriff." Her jaw dropped. Her face turned a shade of crimson I didn't think was physically possible. Her hands trembled, the master key wobbling in midair. What?" she stammered. You can't be." I leaned against my hood, watching her panic unfold. For years, she had terrorized neighbors, issued fines, harassed residents, and flaunted her self-appointed authority. But this time, she had bitten off far more than she could chew. The neighbors had begun to gather, sensing the chaos. Some peeked from windows, some from across the street. But no one intervened, yet they knew this was about to get spectacular. Karen's next move was critical. One wrong step, one misjudged word, and she would officially become the laughingstock of the entire cul-de-sac. And judging by the way her hands shook, Karen's wide-eyed panic was almost mesmerizing. Her tiny hands clutched the so-called master key, shaking so violently it looked like she might drop it at any second. Her voice pitched higher, teetering between shrill outrage and near hysterical desperation. "This can't be. I have the master key. It's supposed to open any car. You can't, sheriff, you have to make it open." She waved the key around like a magic wand, clearly convinced that sheer force of will could bend reality in her favor. I crossed my arms, leaning casually against my car, letting the tension simmer. Karen had spent years bullying neighbors, flaunting HOA rules, threatening fines, towing, and citations. She believed in absolute control. If she wanted something, the world had to comply. But today, the universe had decided to correct her. She had no idea that the car she was demanding access to belonged to the very person she had summoned for help. The neighbors, now fully drawn out onto their lawns, were struggling to contain their laughter. Some whispered to each other, unable to believe the scene. Karen, 911 on speakerphone, frantic over a locked car, insisting she was being wronged. Others simply gawked in disbelief, knowing full well Karen's reputation for overreach. And yet none of them had dared confront her until now. "Karen," I said, voice steady and calm, "let me explain something. That car is mine. The keys are with me. And, as I mentioned, I held up my badge for maximum effect, letting the sunlight reflect off it. I am the sheriff." Her scream was almost audible through the tension. Her eyebrows shot straight up, and she took an involuntary step backward. "No. That's impossible. I called 911. I was right. This is harassment." She waved the key again, but the movement was futile, utterly pointless. The master key that had granted her the illusion of authority for years now had no power. It was a prop, a symbol of control she didn't actually possess. I shook my head slowly, trying to keep a straight face. "Karen, calling 911 doesn't change ownership or authority. It doesn't magically open my car. And yes, technically, you are harassing yourself at this point." A few neighbors snickered. Karen's face turned a deep shade of crimson. Then came the moment of full realization. Her voice dropped, and she stared at me, unable to find a coherent thought. You are the sheriff." Her knees wobbled, and she sank slightly as if gravity itself were punishing her audacity. She had spent years using authority as a weapon, thinking she could bend rules, twist neighbors' lives, and demand compliance. Now she was powerless, caught in her own delusions of control. The tension was thick. Every neighbor's eyes were on her. Every phone camera probably was recording. One wrong word, one wrong move, and Karen's reputation could shatter completely in front of the entire block. But she wasn't done yet. Her next move was going to be interesting. Karen's panic had shifted into a strange, almost comical flurry of action. She started rattling off demands, her words tripping over each other. "You can't just this isn't fair. You must let me in. I have the master key. I have authority. I called 911. You can't ignore the law." Her voice rose higher and higher, cracking with desperation. Every syllable only made it clearer that she had no idea what she was actually doing or who she was dealing with. I remained calm, hands on my hips, surveying the chaos she had created in my driveway. Karen had always thrived on intimidation, using rules, regulations, and her imagined authority to control people. But she had underestimated one critical fact: I enforce the law myself. And the law, unlike Karen's HOA handbook, didn't bend to her whims. The neighbors had stopped laughing, though they were clearly enjoying the spectacle. Now they were more curious than anything else because Karen had just made the single dumbest mistake of her HOA career. She had called the sheriff, demanding action against the car of the sheriff himself. The irony hung in the air like a heavy, unendurable weight. Some whispered to each other, barely suppressing laughter. Others simply shook their heads, knowing they were witnessing the downfall of the neighborhood's most fearsome enforcer. Karen, of course, had no awareness of her audience. She continued shouting into her phone speaker, repeating the same points as though repetition would summon compliance. "Yes, this is an emergency. My key doesn't work. I demand immediate assistance." The 911 operator, if anyone was still listening, must have been extremely confused. I couldn't help but imagine the call recording, the incredulous tone on the other end, and the operator trying to figure out how someone could be so panicked over a locked car in a driveway they did not own. I finally took a step forward. "Karen," I said, slow and deliberate, making her flinch, "do you understand that calling 911 doesn't override property ownership? That waving a master key in the air doesn't grant you access? And most importantly, that I am the sheriff here?" I let a pause linger, letting the words settle in the humid suburban air. Karen froze. The key drooped in her trembling hand. Her face was pale, her breathing erratic. She looked around at the gathered neighbors who were staring, wide-eyed, at the absurdity and then back at me. She had expected compliance, fear, and respect. Instead, she was met with calm authority, the one thing she couldn't bully or manipulate. And in that moment, I realized just how far her panic would go and how completely she had underestimated the consequences of her own arrogance. One wrong word, one desperate move, and she could end up in a situation far worse than embarrassment. Karen's frantic energy began to shift as the reality of the situation started sinking in. Her fingers still trembled around the so-called master key, but her words became slower, more fragmented. I just wanted to. I mean, I thought I had authority, she stammered. Her voice wobbled between indignation and fear. She had never faced someone who didn't bend to her rules, never encountered a neighbor who also happened to enforce the law. Now, the person in charge of the county's law enforcement was calmly standing in front of her, and she couldn't do a single thing about it. The neighbors, meanwhile, had begun to relax, though still amused. Some leaned against fences, others peeked from their lawns, and a few pulled out their phones. They'd long suspected that Karen's ego would eventually trip her up, but they hadn't imagined such a spectacular public display. Karen calling 911 over a locked car, not realizing the car belonged to the sheriff himself. It was the kind of story that would echo through neighborhood gossip for years. I took a step closer, maintaining eye contact. Karen, I said, measured and calm, let me explain something else. HOA authority has limits. Rules don't allow you to harass neighbors, access private property without consent, or apparently call emergency services over personal misunderstandings. And most importantly, they do not apply to me. I let the last words hang. Her face contorted, caught between disbelief and desperation. But this is an emergency. Someone has to respond. I can't just, this is harassment. Someone is denying me access, she gasped for breath, shaking her head. You're supposed to help me. I shook my head slowly. Karen, you don't get to dictate emergencies. That's not how it works. And in this case, the person being harassed, happens to be me. Her eyes widened in horror. She finally realized that she had summoned help that couldn't possibly side with her. She had spent years issuing fines, threatening neighbors, and wielding authority like a weapon. But now, all that aggression was useless. The tool she had relied on for control, the fear, the paperwork, the rules, was meaningless. The sheriff in her panic? Me. The neighbors watching? Silent witnesses. The 911 operator on the other end? Confused beyond belief. And the locked car key in her hand? Nothing but a symbol of her failing power. Karen's next move was crucial. She could surrender gracefully, accept her mistake, and step back, or she could make things worse, trying to salvage authority where none existed. Judging by the way her shoulders stiffened and her lips trembled, I could tell she was about to try something drastic. Karen's panic escalated again, though this time it was tinged with desperation rather than anger. She waved the master key frantically, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. You can't just stand there. This is unacceptable. Someone has to enforce the rules. You must unlock the car. Her voice cracked as she shouted, drawing more neighbors out onto their lawns. Some were leaning over fences, others were peering from open windows, all captivated by the spectacle. Karen had always been the bully, the one issuing fines and threatening people's peace of mind, but now the tables had turned spectacularly. I stayed calm, arms crossed, savoring her frantic energy while remaining firmly in control. Years of handling HOA disputes had taught me patience, but being the sheriff gave me a unique advantage, authority paired with law. She could bark, scream, or wave her key like a wand, but in the face of legal and moral authority, none of her theatrics carried weight. And she knew it, though she refused to admit it aloud. Karen began dialing 911 again, her shaking hands barely managing the buttons. Yes. Hello. This is an emergency. Someone is denying me access to my vehicle. Yes, I have the master key. I demand. She froze mid-sentence, realizing the operator probably wouldn't believe her story. And why would they? A frantic HOA president calling about a locked car, insisting she had special authority, while the car's owner stood casually in front of her, badge glinting in the sunlight. Even I struggled not to chuckle aloud. The neighbors were whispering now, some suppressing laughter, others pointing discreetly. They had long witnessed Karen's power plays and overreaches. They had endured her fines, threats, and endless inspections. And now, seeing her exposed and flustered, they felt a quiet, vicarious satisfaction. Karen's reputation had been built on fear and compliance, but fear didn't work on me, and compliance couldn't be forced anymore. I finally stepped closer, voice calm but firm. Karen, calling 911 repeatedly does not make this your emergency. And your master key doesn't override ownership or authority. This car is mine. And as you now know, I tapped my badge, letting sunlight glint off it. I am the sheriff. Her reaction was instantaneous. The key drooped in her trembling hand. Her jaw fell, eyes wide, and the anger that usually defined her expressions gave way to pure, unfiltered panic. She had spent years controlling her world through intimidation, rules, and petty authority. Today, none of it worked. Karen's next move would determine just how far this humiliation could go. One wrong word, one desperate attempt to assert control, and the entire block would witness her undoing. And judging by the trembling of her lips and the wild darting of her eyes, she was seconds away from an irreversible mistake. Karen's panic had reached a fever pitch. Her trembling hands continued to clutch the master key, though it had long since lost its supposed power. She darted her eyes around, desperately searching for some authority to back her up, but there was none. I was standing there, calm, collected, and fully in control. The neighbors, still watching from lawns and windows, were holding back laughter but clearly enjoying every moment of her unraveling. Years of her HOA intimidation, fines, and threats had all been built on the illusion of control, and now that illusion was collapsing in real time. You don't understand. Karen squeaked, pointing the key toward me like a wand. This car should be accessible. You can't just deny me. Her voice faltered, and she trailed off, realizing that no one was buying her argument. Her usual arsenal of fear and authority had failed spectacularly. The key, once a symbol of imagined supremacy, now looked pitiful in her shaking hand. I stepped closer, letting the tension build just enough to make her realize her mistake. Karen, I said calmly, you need to understand something. Authority only works when it's legitimate. Rules only have power when they're backed by law. You've called 911 over a private vehicle you do not own, demanding access to a car that belongs to me, sheriff of this county. The law isn't on your side here, and neither is common sense. Her face drained of color. Her lips quivered as she opened her mouth to respond but could only manage a strangled, I called 911. Her voice cracked under the weight of embarrassment and disbelief. She had imagined herself enforcing justice, instead, she had summoned it upon herself. And the irony was not lost on the gathering neighbors, who now openly whispered and exchanged glances of incredulous amusement. Karen's frantic energy was quickly turning into despair. She realized that every threat, every fine, every overreach she had employed over the years meant nothing when faced with true authority. And now, her mistakes weren't just embarrassing, they were witnessed by the entire block. Every neighbor who had endured her reign of petty terror was now a silent witness to her unraveling. Finally, she dropped the key, letting it clatter to the ground. Her hands trembled at her sides. She had no plan, no allies, and no means to regain control. Every ounce of her bluffing and intimidation had failed spectacularly. The sheriff stood before her, calm, patient, and resolute, while the crowd of neighbors observed in stunned silence. Karen's empire of fear had collapsed in an instant. Her next move would define whether she could salvage even a shred of dignity or descend into complete humiliation. Karen's defeat was visible in every tremor of her body. She stood frozen, staring at the key she had once wielded like a weapon, now useless on the concrete driveway. Her face was pale, lips parted in disbelief, and her breathing shallow. For years, she had thrived on controlling her neighborhood with fines, threats, and relentless scrutiny, but now, all of that power had evaporated in a single, embarrassing moment. The realization hit her hard: she was no longer in charge. In fact, she had never been in charge, only an illusion of authority, now shattered before every pair of eyes on the block. The neighbors, who had been watching the chaos unfold, began to relax, though some couldn't hide their smirks. They had long feared Karen's wrath, endured her petty fines, and tiptoed around her overzealous enforcement of HOA rules. But now they were seeing firsthand that she was not infallible. She had called 911 on a car that belonged to the sheriff, and the sheriff was standing right in front of her. Karen's next reaction was a flurry of frantic words, broken and almost nonsensical. I can't, this isn't fair. I have the master key. I called the authorities. You can't do this. Her voice rose and fell in pitch, a chaotic mix of indignation, panic, and disbelief. The words tumbled out, but none carried weight anymore. No one moved to defend her, no one was afraid. I remained calm, letting the silence stretch before answering. Karen, I said, voice steady and controlled, the law doesn't bend to your whims. Your so-called master key doesn't override property ownership. And calling 911 doesn't change the fact that you were harassing me, the car's owner, in my own driveway. I let the words sink in, watching as her face registered a slow dawning horror. Her hands trembled, her mouth opened and closed, but no coherent sentence emerged. The neighbors whispered among themselves, some laughing quietly, others shaking their heads. It was a rare, unspoken moment of justice. Karen's overconfidence and aggression had finally collided with reality. Then came the final act of surrender. Karen slowly lowered her arms, letting the key fall to the ground. The clang echoed faintly across the driveway, a symbolic punctuation mark. She finally realized that nothing she had ever wielded, no threats, no fines, no fabricated authority, could stand against genuine law and oversight. The sheriff, the real authority, was not only present, but unimpressed. Her ego, carefully cultivated over years of neighborhood domination, had crumbled in front of everyone. Karen's world of control and intimidation was gone, replaced by embarrassment, disbelief, and a profound sense of helplessness. Karen stood frozen, her gaze locked on the fallen key at her feet. For the first time, the air around her wasn't tense with authority, it was thick with defeat. The neighbors were still watching, some leaning against fences, some holding their phones discreetly, capturing every second. The block had witnessed countless HOA disputes, but nothing quite like this. Karen, the self-appointed enforcer, reduced to a trembling figure in front of the very person she thought she could command, me, the sheriff. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice shaking. I followed the rules. I have authority, her words faltered, trailing off into incoherence. She was grasping at fragments of power that no longer existed. All the fines she had issued, all the intimidation tactics, all the rules she had twisted for her own advantage, none of it mattered anymore. The illusion of control had dissolved, leaving her exposed. I took a step forward, deliberately calm, making sure she could see that she was no longer in charge. Karen, I said, voice steady, you've spent years thinking that authority comes from fear. That control is enforced through intimidation. But authority is earned, not taken. And calling 911 to enforce your personal whims. That's harassment, not leadership. Her eyes darted around nervously, and she realized that everyone present, the neighbors who had once feared her, were witnesses to her unraveling. They weren't laughing openly, but the mix of shock, relief, and quiet amusement was evident. Karen had underestimated the consequences of her actions. She had assumed compliance, feared no one, and bullied without accountability. Today, she faced accountability fully, publicly, and with no escape. Karen's breathing became shallow, her lips trembling. She bent down and picked up the key again, but this time, her movements were tentative, almost childlike. She glanced at it, then at me, as if hoping the key might magically restore the control she had lost. But there was no magic left. The sheriff, the law, the neighborhood all stood firm. Her power had evaporated. Finally, she let the key fall to the ground, the metallic clatter echoing softly, a symbolic end to her reign. She stepped back, trembling, eyes wide with disbelief, realizing that her plan had not only failed, it had spectacularly backfired. Her ego, meticulously inflated over years of HOA domination, had been punctured in front of everyone. Her authority, built on fear and deception, was gone. The neighbors exchanged glances, some relieved, some quietly celebrating the exposure of her arrogance. Karen's next move would determine if she accepted this reality or tried to dig herself deeper into embarrassment. But one thing was clear: she had lost control entirely. Karen's defeat was complete. The key lay on the driveway, useless and symbolic, while she stood frozen, realizing that her imagined authority had evaporated entirely. The neighbors, who had long endured her petty fines, constant inspections, and arbitrary rules, now stared in silent satisfaction. Karen had built her reputation on intimidation, but today she had met someone who would not comply, who would not be bullied, and who had the real authority to enforce consequences. I crossed my arms and looked her in the eyes, my tone calm but firm. Karen, let's be clear, this isn't a question of rules, or keys, or who thinks they're in charge. It's about harassment, boundaries, and respecting the law. You've repeatedly overstepped those lines, and today you've done it spectacularly. Her face paled even further, if that was possible. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She had nothing left. The power she relied on for so many years, fear, intimidation, and the illusion of HOA authority, was gone. The reality had hit her full force: she wasn't in control, she never truly had been, and the sheriff wasn't someone she could manipulate or command. The neighbors began to relax, some chuckling quietly, others nodding to each other in relief. They had witnessed a public reckoning, something they had long hoped for but never expected to see. Karen had become a living lesson in what happens when ego and unchecked authority collide with law and reason. I gestured toward the fallen key. That's all that remains of your authority here, Karen. Everything else, threats, fines, intimidation, is meaningless without respect, fairness, and legal standing. Karen's lips quivered. She finally sank onto the curb, overwhelmed, realizing she had lost not only this battle but the credibility she had cultivated for years. The neighbors' stares were not angry, they were just sober reminders of how her actions had affected the entire community. She had used fear as a tool, but fear couldn't stand against truth and justice. The 911 operator, still probably bewildered, would have heard the final collapse of Karen's self-imposed empire. And the neighbors would have a story to retell for years: the day HOA Karen tried to enforce her power over a car, and the car's owner turned out to be the sheriff. As I finally walked back to my vehicle, Karen sitting on the curb, key abandoned, I felt a sense of closure. Justice had been served, quietly but firmly, without violence, without drama, just truth, authority, and the unraveling of arrogance. Karen had learned her lesson, though probably not gracefully, but the neighborhood could finally breathe. Peace had returned. For now.